This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Organized Crime and Punishment. Today, I am joined by Mustache Chris. As usual, Mustache, how are you doing?
Doing quite well myself. How are you?
I'm not bad, and I'm ready to dig into the next part of Crazy Joe Gallo's life. We are taking a whole series of episodes to look at the fascinating life of Joe Gallo, mobster from the classical golden age. And I would almost dare say that he invented the golden age of the Mafia in a way. You could really say that he encapsulated the whole ethos of the golden age of the Mafia. And today we are going to continue with the second half of his life. We really almost maybe the last 2/3 of his life, because we broke down Joe Gallo's life into really three distinct phases. And we're going to look at those last two phases, which are really tell such a fascinating story and of the entire Mafia during the 50s, 60s, and into the early 70s. So, Chris, why don't we left off, Joe was just about to go to prison. And if you want to hear why Joe went to prison in detail, you can go and listen or even re-listen to the last episode. But more or less, through a series of circumstances involving the Mafia and involving a lot of Joe's activities, he winds up doing a pretty hard bit in jail. So let's pick up with Joe's life in the correctional system.
Yeah, just quickly, Joe Gallo, he was caught extorting a local businessman in a sting operation. He would get sentenced of 7 to 14 years in prison, obviously. And during his stint, he would end up serving in 3 different prisons: Green Haven Correctional, Attica Correctional Facility, and Auburn Correctional Facility. And they're all in New York State.
And that's actually a thing about New York State that I do know quite a bit about, is these prisons. They are the toughest of the tough for a guy who, what he did was pretty low rent on the scale of violent crime. They threw him into the toughest prisons in the whole state.
I just assumed the judge knew that he was responsible for a bunch of other stuff, and they just happened to catch him on this, and they were like, yeah, you're not getting off easy. Basically, we're going to throw you in the tough prisons. No, he probably deserved to be in those tough prisons. We're talking about Joe Gallo here, right? He ran a mob war, so I wouldn't want him in a low security prison. He's the type of guy that would probably break out.
Yeah, or just run the place. Yeah, these are prisons, especially at that time where, this is the time. And you'll actually get to hear an episode on the Attica uprising, Attica riots that happened just a little bit after the death of Joe Gallo. These places are as close to hell on earth as you can possibly get.
Yeah. And so I think if people are familiar with the movie Crazy Joe, we recorded a podcast on it and we're going to release it. But, while Joe was at prison, Larry and Albert and the other Gallo crews, this is just part of the whole Gallo crew mythology, saved 6 children and a mother from a building, a burning building that was right near the dormitory. And it's depicted quite famously in the Crazy Joe movie. But in that movie, and I understand the reasoning for it, is they showed that Joe Gallo was there, but he wasn't actually there. It was his 2 brothers. I'm sure Joe would have been right there with his brothers saving the kids too. And it was a pretty big news story at the time. Apparently it was all over the newspapers. It was on TV, and like the Gallo crew got some good press from the media for a little bit from this. Rightfully so. They saved 6 kids and a mother, and it's just kind of bizarre that this crew that was part of the mafia, extorting people, doing all kinds of things they shouldn't be doing, and running a mafia war, were getting good press by the media. I don't know. It's funny.
Now, moving on. While Joe was in prison, that's happening. What's happening about a fellow that we're going to get to know a little bit, Nicky Barnes?
Yeah. So, when Joe Gallo was serving time at Greenhaven, he would get into contact with a gentleman named Nicky Barnes, who I think deserves like his own kind of little moment here, because he becomes one of the biggest drug dealers in American history down the road. I think eventually we'll end up doing a series on this guy, but we're just going to keep it kind of short here for the purposes of the Joe Gallo story. So Nicky Barnes was born on October 15th, 1933 in Harlem, New York. Barnes was he was a pretty good student growing up, but left home at a young age to escape his father was an abusive alcoholic, and he ended up turning to drug dealing for an income, which is, at that time, it's just not surprising. There was only so many ways to make money, and drug dealing was a good way to make money. And if you were smart, like Nicky Barnes was, you could probably be half decent at it. But Barnes would end up breaking the golden rule of not getting high on your own supply. He would become a heroin addict for several years, and it was during a prison stint that Nicky would eventually end his heroin addiction. I don't know how much of a choice he had, right? He probably, it was difficult to get the drugs in the prison, or he decided himself, it's like, I'm just gonna, I'm in prison, I might as well just crack the habit now. What a better place to do it. And in 1965, Nicky Barnes went to jail for just like a kind of low end drug dealing nonetheless, but low end. It wasn't like at this point he was trafficking large amounts of drugs. And this is where him and Joe Gallo met. He also met a gentleman named Matthew Madonna, who was a big time drug dealer. It was while in prison that Gallo apparently taught Barnes the ins and outs of running a drug trafficking business in an organized crime fashion. And this connection would lead to a lifelong partnership between Joe and Barnes. Joe would also be unique in the sense that where with the Mafia at this time, they just didn't work with black gangs. Like, I'm sure they did some work, but they weren't like partners at all. They weren't progressive at that time. I wouldn't be surprised if it's still to this day, to be honest with you. Maybe it's a little different. But it definitely made Joe stand out. And Barnes would later end up setting up something called the Council, which is basically the black gang equivalent of the Commission, and would end up going, and like I pointed out earlier, would end up becoming one of the biggest drug dealers in American history.
That's a really fascinating part of the story with Nicky Barnes, because in a way, it kind of does set up like these cross connections that the Mafia would start making. And it was taboo, but it was almost, you had to do it with all these other gangs. But that's not the only crazy part of Crazy Joe's story. Let's start to dig into his time in prison, because he seems to be involved in just the entire zeitgeist of the age. And these prison riots is definitely a huge part of the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah, so while he was at Greenhaven, Joe would end up suing the prison in one of the more bizarre stories in the many bizarre stories that we've covered thus far in Joe Gallo's life. Joe would be getting a haircut, which seems like kind of like a typical everyday kind of thing, but in this prison it was segregated. So white barbers would only cut white people's hairs, and black barbers would cut black people's hairs. I mean, it was segregated by law.
And this was New York. He's not in Mississippi or something like that. This is in New York.
Yeah, I don't know why, but it was to the point of hair cutting, which is just, I don't know. You read sometimes about this, like the segregation and stuff like that went on in the States in terms of like it's cutting hair. Like I don't know. I don't get it. Well, Joe the Rebel, he always decided to get his hair cut by the black barber. And once the guards found out what was happening, they took action, which then led to a mini prison riot over cutting hair. Joe would end up suing the prison for cruel and unusual punishment, which, given the circumstances, he probably had a pretty good case. The prison would argue that Joe was just looking to stir up trouble, which, I mean, let's be honest, there's probably a bit of it was that. I'm sure there's a part of him that was kind of outraged that it was segregated too, because, like, as we pointed out, Joe worked side by side with black criminals and black people in general. Yeah, and just this whole moment actually would get Joe kind of tangentially involved in the civil rights movement. I know that sounds kind of bizarre, but he was kind of part of it. And as we get into the story a little bit later, we'll start hearing about civil rights movements more, but in kind of a more bizarre way.
It's very interesting that Joe, for a criminal and a hardcore criminal, he had a really strong idea of right and wrong. Like throughout everything that he did in his whole life, he really took a right and wrong stand in a really twisted way, but he did.
Well, yeah, I mean, even if you look at the first Colombo War, right? That's basically what it was, is he thought him and his crew were being wronged. They were getting underpaid and they were getting screwed over. And Joe's like, you know what? I'm going to take drastic action. Like, this is wrong. And no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And he was uncompromising about it. And in a lot of ways, this haircutting incident is another example of it.
Now, Joe, when he was in prison, he didn't just waste his time in there. He really did it. And another thing that just blows your mind about this guy is he really leans into bettering himself. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, Joe would end up going to Auburn Correctional Facility. I didn't find out exactly why he got moved. I assume it was because of that prison riot. That mini riot at the barber shop. But yeah, and he would end up adding more to his own legend. Joe would become a ravenous reader. He'd read anything from, legal matters to history to fiction. He would actually learn a speed reading technique that was popular at the time. And kind of as a side note, it's something I've noticed with remarkable individuals, good or evils. They have this ability to take in tons of information quickly and retain only what's actually really necessary. If you go throughout history, you look at like remarkable world leaders or inventors or scientists, they all seem to have this ability to be able to just take in tons and only keep what's important and just kind of filter out everything else. Joe would take up writing poetry too, where he would write beautiful flowing verses, but would also apparently beautifully describe ripping your insides out, ripping somebody's insides out. I'm a half decent writer myself, so I can kind of relate to that. I used to be able to write short horror stories, so and then I can also write sappy love letters. Anyone check on my Facebook status for my anniversary yesterday, you'll see. Yeah, and Joe would take up watercoloring, which his art, while it's not really my taste, I can kind of say it's at least interesting as abstract art. Joe would also work as an elevator operator, which I assume meant that he was responsible for the maintenance of the elevator too.
And then in a scene that they describe in the Crazy Joe movie, Joe gets involved in a prison riot as well.
Yeah, like you point out, and like kind of another bizarre moment in Joe's tenure in prison, in the prison system, he would end up saving like a prison guard of all people. During a massive riot at Auburn Correctional Facility, Joe Gallo rescued a correctional officer who was severely wounded behind enemy lines. This correctional officer would later testify on behalf of Joe, which, given his life so far, is quite an accomplishment. On a sadder note, it was at this time that Joe Gallo was in prison. His brother his brother Larry would die of cancer.
What was going on while Joe was in prison? The Mafia didn't stand still. What were some of the events on the outside?
Yeah, so while Joe was building his legend, while Joe was building on his legend in prison, a lot was happening to the family he was still technically part of. On June 7th, 1962, Joe Profaci would die of natural causes. Joe Profaci's right-hand man, Magliocco, would take over the family, continue the first Colombo War. The Gallo crew would get revenge on Carmine Persico on May 19th, 1963, where he was shot multiple times, but they didn't actually get the deed done. This would be a thing that would run with Carmine all the time for the rest of his life. We're going to end up doing a series on Carmine Persico. Such a big character. There's no way that we can't do it. Yeah, and if you haven't noticed, there's like a lot of legends that are being made during the Joe Gallo story in the Mafia. At this time, just people that are directly related to Joe Gallo or people that are tangentially related to Joe Gallo. Raymond Patriarca, who later in 1963 would help broker a peace between the Gallos and the Profaci family, thus ending the first Colombo War. Raymond Patriarca is a guy we'll probably end up getting into during the course of this podcast. Like, he ran big chunks of New England and in particular Providence, Rhode Island. I don't know if your audience is familiar with Buddy Yancey. He was like the mayor of Providence, and he
super corrupt.
And him and Raymond Patriarca had there's connections. I think we ended up doing a series on that because it's such a bizarre story. Magliocco would actually be forced out of the Mafia once the commission discovered that he helped facilitate the potential overthrow of the entire system by Joe Bonanno. We touch on this a bit in the Five Families in the 5 episode series. Joe Colombo is actually the guy is actually the person that helped expose the plots, and as a Gambino family ally would be installed as the new head of the Profaci family, which will end up having its name changed to the Colombo family.
And now let's take a look at Joe Colombo. He's another person who's really central to this whole story, and somebody we almost certainly, if we don't, we're going to revisit him again in this series. And he really spirals into a lot of the other stories we'll talk about.
Yeah, Joe Colombo is one of the more fascinating guys in the Mafia. I think I think a lot of the times he's kind of dismissed or I don't know, kind of ridiculed, but we'll get into that in later episodes, or we'll get into it a little bit in this episode, actually, why I think he's quite fascinating. Joe Colombo was born in Brooklyn, New York on June 16th, 1923. His father, Anthony Colombo, was actually a member of the Profaci family. Anthony was actually one of the earliest members of the Profaci family. And if you listen to our flyover episode on the Colombo family or the Profaci family was actually the youngest of all the 5 families. But it didn't end up good for Anthony, actually. So let's get into that. Anthony was found strangled to death in his car with his mistress in 1938. I find it fascinating that Joe Colombo would continue to join the Mafia life after it murdered his father. I wonder what type of person does it take to do that? I don't know. What do you think?
I wonder if it's just that's the life. He knew what it was going to entail. Is that if you wanted to do that, that could be a part of it. Every story that I've seen of mafia where it's passed along in the family, they must know what they're getting into, even if it's not your own father directly. Uncles, cousins, friends, friends of friends. You would see all the time. It wouldn't be a mystery that could happen to you.
I guess, but it's his own dad. That's the thing, right? Like, that's the thing that makes me pause and go, like, this literally killed your dad. Like, do I really want to do this? But, he ends up doing it, right? Joe Colombo would make it to, he would actually make it to high school, attending school for 2 years before dropping out to join the United States Coast Guard. But he would be discharged after being diagnosed with neurosis, which I think is not all that surprising, to be honest with you, given the fact that his dad was killed by the mob and he was probably hanging around in those circles. I can see somebody becoming neurotic, given the situation. Joe would actually work a fair amount of like legitimate jobs. Like, he worked 10 years as a longshoreman. I'm sure he was running scams all on the side doing that. And, stuff was falling off the ships. But, he worked as a salesman too, at a meat packing plant. I'm sure he was doing some shady stuff there, but he was a salesman. And he became like his last legitimate job before he went full on into the lifestyle he was a real estate man.
Which again, that has plenty of opportunities to get into all sorts of scams.
Yeah.
And
you know what I mean? Yeah, there's a pattern, right? But
what was his real career though?
But it's but like you read about some of these guys, and some of them like don't ever work any jobs, right? And then Joe's he's actually working jobs, right? Probably he's doing scams, but he's working them. Joe Colombo would end up becoming one of the top enforcers in the mob, and became a cop while running his own crew. And like I pointed out, I find it remarkable that I don't know, he ended up going down this road, and like his boss, Joe Profaci, most likely is the guy that ordered the hit of his dad, and that's your boss. Like I just find it I don't know, it makes me. I don't know. I don't understand the type of person that could do it.
It really does seem like that was just, again, that's a part of the life, I guess. Like his dad knew what he was getting into. He knew what he was getting into. I can almost see that.
Yeah. So Joe Colombo was obviously on the side of the Profaci family during the war, but I'll be honest with you guys, like maybe you guys can direct me to some information, but I found it a little bit difficult to find like what direct involvement he had in the first Colombo War, like exactly what he was doing. As we already touched on, Joe Gallo was in prison. Joe Profaci would die, and he leaved Magliocco in charge. And as already touched on, while Joe Gallo was in prison, Profaci would die of natural causes, and Magliocco would be in charge. We already kind of touched on this. Him and Joe Bonanno came with this massive plot. They were going to take out the commission, and Joe Colombo was actually one of the guys given the contract. I believe his job was to take out Tommy Lucchese, and Joe Colombo, seeing a massive opportunity here, decided to pull Carmine Persico and pulled off the old double cross. He informed the commission of Joe Bonanno's plan and Magliocco's plan, which resulted in him being rewarded the boss of the family. And at age 41, Joe Colombo was the youngest boss of the era, and remarkably was the very first boss of a major crime family that was major mafia crime family that was actually American born. That's crazy that it took this long.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. Yeah, I guess it is really surprising, and it's the whole thing is surprising, and it kind of blows your expectations of somebody so young flying through so high up through the ranks, and then that all of these guys were foreign born. I mean, you figure somebody like Lucky Luciano's a full generation before Joe Colombo. And he was a very young child. Like, you would have thought by this point that it would have worked through the system, that some more American made guys would have gotten to the top of or American born guys, I should say, had risen through the ranks.
Yeah, you would think one guy, right? But unless I'm mistaken, that Joe Colombo was the first guy. From what I've read, which is, it is quite remarkable. So Joe's time as boss was, like we've talked to, it was pretty fascinating. It's an almost black and white tenure, and depending on how you look at it, when he came on the scene, Joe Colombo had a calming effect on the entire Colombo family. Like, the craziness of the Gallo-Profaci feud had stopped. There was very little internal conflict from what I've read, and they started to focus on what a successful mob family should do, and is make money and acquire more power, right? I mean, that's why you start a criminal organization, right? Now, the other side of Joe Colombo's rule was the exact opposite of this, and we move on into one of the more bizarre and fascinating moments in American mafia history, Joe Colombo's Italian Civil Rights League. We're going to plan on doing like a deep dive episode later on this, because both me and Steve find it fascinating. And there's actually a lot there. I think a lot of people just kind of dismiss it out of hand, that it's silly. But it's really not, actually, if you just kind of scratch a little bit above the surface.
Yeah, for our story today, we really won't need to know too much about this Italian American Civil Rights League. Just the fact that it really did exist. Joe Colombo was behind it, but it leads into the next part of when Crazy Joe finally does get released from jail.
Yeah, like you were saying, like under Joe Colombo's guidance, like the Italian Civil Rights League became a full big movement real quick. And Joe Gallo would end up getting released from prison on April 11th, 1971. And his second wife commented on his appearance, saying he looked like an old man. He was a bag of bones. You could see the remnants of what was a strikingly handsome man in his youth. He had beautiful features, a beautiful nose, a beautiful mouth, and piercing blue eyes. And actually, if you do look at pictures of Joe from before prison and when he got after prison, you'll see that, yeah, he actually did lose a lot of weight. Joe out of prison is probably the pictures that most people are probably most familiar with, because this is when he sort of ends up becoming a celebrity, which we're about to get to in a second. Joe Gallo would end up joining high society when he got out of prison, and believe it or not, during his time in prison, he actually became like somewhat of a celebrity. Gallo reminds me a bit of like the older gangsters that came out of the Prohibition era who became celebrities. Like, we did an episode on Jack Legs Diamond, and then there's obviously Al Capone, and there's numerous examples. I find like once the late to mid 1940s rolled around, there was a general effort by everybody in the mob to stay out of the spotlight, and like those who tried to go into the spotlight, there was self-correcting mechanisms in place to kind of take care of those individuals, that they were bringing too much media attention or too much of like a celebrity status around, because led to people asking questions, where's this money come from, who's this person, what does this person do? It makes sense, it's a secret society, keep it secret. But in some ways, I think Joe, he reminds me of some of those old Prohibition gangsters that were all over the news and had no problem talking to the media. I don't know, what do you think?
I think that there was always with the criminals, that there's always an attraction to them by the high society. I don't know what it is, that they think they're quote unquote slumming or what it is, but it just, especially in this time period, I mean, you have books written about it by books by people like Tom Wolfe, like Mau Mauing the Flatcatchers, and all these really, really rich and wealthy people, and they're getting involved in essentially street crime. Or I mean, this is the time when Patty Hearst is getting involved with terrorism. There's again, that seemed to be a thing that Joe got himself into, the zeitgeist of hanging out with in all the fanciest clubs and with all the richest people. But maybe because he exuded that charisma and power and danger and everything.
That's what I think it is too, right? I mean, I'm sure rich celebrity people get bored hanging out with other rich celebrity people too, right? And want to hang out with a guy from the streets like Joe Gallo, right? It's different, right? It's not something that's
cool.
Typically around, right? There's somebody who's different than everybody else. I mean, it makes sense to me. I know sometimes I'm like that. Yeah, it was at this time that Joe Gallo became friends with Jerry Orbach. Yeah, it's that Jerry Orbach that became famous for, it was Law and Order, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huge.
Jerry Orbach would go on to depict Sally Colombo in the movie The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. And we recorded a podcast on that one. It was interesting. That was apparently the character was inspired by his friend Joe Gallo, or he borrowed heavily from Joe Gallo in terms of how he depicted that character. So, and like I said, we recorded a podcast on that, so you guys are getting the whole like Joe Gallo experience.
And I mean, if you ever thought that there wasn't a need for an Italian American Civil Rights League, watch that movie. And I mean, that's the movie that even making fun of Italians you couldn't make today.
Yeah, it's I'm sure, but I don't know. I think we talked about it on that podcast a little bit, where I think people just had a sense of humor about themselves a little bit more than they do now. Once Joe Gallo was at a prison, he was actually invited to a meeting with Joe Colombo and Joseph Iacovelli with the purposes of just officially squashing the beef. It's like, hey, Joe, it's over. Let's take care of business. Apparently, Joe Gallo asked for $100,000 to end all hostilities, claiming that the 1963 peace agreement didn't apply to him because he was in prison at the time. I mean, his logic, it makes sense. Like, I wasn't there. I was practically in charge of this crew. You guys came with this peace agreement while I was in prison. I had no say in it. I mean, it makes sense. It seems a little crazy. Hence the nickname Crazy Joe. But
yeah.
I mean, from his perspective, it kind of does make sense, does it not?
I mean, in a way, though, that don't you get that asking for such a preposterous amount of money? I mean, I don't know the offhand, but that's not asking for chump change. He really was arguing. I think he was sick of it all. Like I mean, from everything that I get from Joe, when he got out of jail, he was done with it and he wasn't going to play the games anymore. It was going to be balls to the wall and win or lose, I'm doing it.
Well, I mean, Joe Colombo was annoyed and he was flabbergasted by this whole situation. And told Gallo, I'm giving you $1,000 or you can just bugger off. Use different language than that, but we try to keep it family friendly, which Joe Gallo refused and said, the war's back on. It's just such a bizarre thing, like the war's over, like your crew agreed to it. You come out of prison, you're just like, no, I want $100,000. Otherwise we're just going to start this all up again. And new boss. Like the guy you had the beef with was with Joe Profaci. It had nothing to do with Colombo. And Colombo's like, I don't even know. Like, what are you talking? He was like, I'm not giving you $100,000. Are you nuts? And I mean, Joe Colombo just must have been like, I don't know what to do with this guy. But that's why he has the nickname Crazy Joe.
Yeah, such a mismatch of ideas going on there. And I have to imagine at this point, there's not a huge age difference between. You think that Joe Colombo is an old guy, old Mafia don, but he's not dramatically older than Joe at this point. They kind of in a way are a meeting of equals.
They are. I think we'll get into, I mean, at this point, Joe Colombo, became boss at 41. So say he's like 43, 44 at this point. By the time that Joe Gallo is killed, he was 43, so they're practically the same age. I mean, they grew up in the same family together too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now let's we're in June of 1971. Joe is out. Joe Gallo is out. He has absolutely irreconcilable differences with Joe Colombo. Where does it go from here?
Yeah, so on June 28th, 1971, Joe Colombo was holding his second Italian civil rights rally, which, I suggest you guys look it up on YouTube. There's video of it. It's actually pretty impressive. Unfortunately for Joe Colombo on this day, he would be shot 3 times at this rally, with one of them being in the head. Jerome A. Johnson was the shooter. And there's a lot of weird stuff with this shooting, in my opinion. I'm not the only one. There's a bunch of other people who have who think there's a lot of weird stuff going on here. Jerome Johnson was killed like almost immediately by Colombo's bodyguards after. But what was Jerome's motivation is where it starts getting murky. The Colombo family was convinced that Joe Gallo was the one who hired Jerome Johnson, which, given his relationship with the black criminal underworld and his feud with Colombo, I mean, it's pretty good guess. It's what I would have thought. The cops during the investigation came to the conclusion that Joe Gallo had nothing to do with it and that Jerome had acted alone. I mean, that's a possibility too, right? Where somebody's they're crazy, right? And they do crazy stuff. I mean, it's not unheard of. Like now from my reading, then this may be possible, given that like Jerome had like a mental health issues, right? So I mean, it's possible that, like I pointed out, he wasn't the most mentally well guy. The other possibility was that maybe members of the commission hired Jerome to do the hit. It makes sense from the standpoint of the commission because the Italian Civil Rights League was like a big spotlight on the mob, and we had touched on that earlier. At this time, the mob they didn't want the spotlight, they didn't want the media attention. Like Joe Colombo was doing interviews with the TV media, news media, the radio media. He was all over the place. And I mean, why would they pick Jerome Johnson? I mean, well, he was black for one, so people would automatically think that Joe Gallo was involved in it, and nobody would think like, oh, was the commission that actually did it? We know that Jerome used to like to hang out around wise guys and pretend like he was a wise guy, even though he was never going to be a wise guy. I mean, this would be a pretty perfect patsy for the commission. You think about it, people would immediately suspect Joe, or otherwise they say, oh, this guy's mentally ill. Like my personal opinion, I mean, to me, the more plausible things, the commission hired him to do the hits because they wanted to get Joe out of the picture, he was just crazy and thought, like if I take out Joe Colombo and maybe these wise guys will let me into their little group. I don't think Joe Gallo had anything to do with it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that it's probably like 80% that Jerome Johnson had some visions of grandeur that he was going to, be the one who whacked. I mean, I guess there could be a million reasons, but he was either probably 80% lone gunman, 20% actually was hired by the commission or maybe pushed in that direction by someone, or I mean, minuscule that this was like some grand scheme cooked up by Joe Gallo. It just doesn't seem right. Like, if Joe Gallo did it, why wouldn't he do it something very public to make sure everybody knew it was Joe Gallo?
Well, that's my thing. I think Joe Gallo's the type of guy, he would have just done it himself if he was going to do it.
Or have a member of his crew do it or something that's obvious, no question.
There's no question. Like, yeah, look I'm Joe Gallo and look what I just did on TV type thing, right?
Yeah.
That's the type of, from everything that we've read and everything we've discussed on both of these podcasts, I mean, that's the conclusion you reach, right? That's one of the reasons why his nickname was Crazy, right? Crazy Joe Gallo, right? Because he did crazy things that people didn't do typically.
I guess you could say, though, is it so crazy putting yourself in the mindset of the 1970s, early 1970s? Could he have thought that only Crazy Joe would hire a black guy to do this on TV?
It's possible. From my reading, I don't think Joe knew this guy though. Like that, there was like no connection between the two, like through friends of friends. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe somebody can point me into another direction that gives me different information. But from everything that I've read and what the police investigated, there was no connection between these two guys.
And it just seems too clever by half. I'm just throwing it out there, but it just, almost, but not quite. I think that if Joe was going to do it, it would have been much more direct and much more obvious.
Which is basically everything that Joe did. It was very obvious that it was him, right? Because he would brag about this stuff, right? I mean, he all the time he would brag about the crazy stuff that he would do. Joe Colombo actually didn't die at the from the shooting. He ended up spending a couple of years basically on in and out of life support and in the hospital after this shooting. He would die soonish after, but it wasn't immediately. Pretty horrible way to go out.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Now, what happens in the fallout of Joe Colombo being shot?
Yeah, after the Colombo shooting, Joe Gallo was, believe it or not, put under police protection for a little while. I mean, this isn't as crazy as some people would probably think at first, but, kind of like, let's look at it from the law enforcement perspective. It wouldn't look good if Colombo had just been shot at a massive rally, like on TV. And then a minor celebrity who was a suspect in the murder was killed soon after. It just wouldn't look good on the authorities that a full-on mob war was breaking out right under their noses. And they weren't doing much to kind of prevent it or stop it. So at least for a couple of weeks until, I guess, the news cycle changed. I mean, now it's a couple of hours. It would take a couple of weeks back then. Joe was basically, cops walked around with him at all times. And on April 7th, 1972, Joe Gallo, along with his wife, sister, and his daughter and his bodyguard, celebrated his birthday. They actually they spent time with Jerry Orbach at the Copacabana, and would later find themselves at Umberto's Clam house for some good Italian food. Now, this is where the story takes many twists and turns. Joseph Luparelli claims he was at the restaurant at the time that Joe Gallo was there, and then almost immediately left for nearby Colombo hangout to inform them where Joe Gallo was. Luparelli says he watched from the car as 4 gunmen entered the restaurant and shot Joe Gallo. Luparelli, as a story, gained wide publicity at the time, but upon closer inspection by the police, in particular Joe Coffey, the story just doesn't seem that believable. Coffey always had believed the man that shot Joe Gallo was a lone gunman, and he claims that the police purposely put out the story of 3 or more gunmen to kind of weed out crappy informants. Joe Coffey is a quite famous detective in relation to mob-related matters. We'll probably end up doing a little series on him. He has quite a lot of books that he wrote and quite a lot of stories. One thing that makes me believe that Luparelli's story is kind of garbage is because nothing came out of it. Like, not a single person was charged with the shooting of Joe Gallo, which just seems unbelievable to me. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I thought the whole thing is pretty unbelievable. That there's just, I mean, and we'll talk about some other theories, but just like nothing solid at all came out of it. But this famous guy gets gunned down in the middle of a busy part of the city, and there's just no clue of what happened is pretty bizarre.
Yeah, that's the thing. And like it, if this guy's story was good, then okay, why was no one charged? He's admitting to being in the car, yet he doesn't name any of the gunmen. And like the whole thing seems, I don't know. The whole thing, I don't believe it. Somebody would have been charged with something, or at least charged. Whether they went to prison or not is a different story.
Or somebody be talking about somebody, or somebody was with somebody. It's something more would come out than just, a black hole.
So I don't know. I don't believe this story. I mean, Joe Coffey, he's got issues, but he didn't believe it either. I mean, he's not a dumb guy. So we'll move on to, I guess, one of the more popular theories that came out of Joe Gallo's shooting. Frank Sheeran claimed in the book, I Heard You Paint Houses, that he was the man that killed Joe Gallo. This shooting is actually famously depicted in the movie The Irishman. This is an interesting one because there are reasons for Frank to lie about this. One obviously being it would help sell the book that was based on his life, thus help it make more money, right? Oh, like this guy's admitting to shooting Joe Gallo. Like this, we don't know who killed Joe Gallo, that type of thing. The other thing though is for people who have actually read the book, like Frank isn't bragging about the stuff that he did in his life. Like he isn't proud of it. And the whole book kind of reads like a man's last confession, kind of like The Irishman is. For the people who have actually watched The Irishman, you're not dealing with a guy that's happy about what he did. You're dealing with a guy that's like, I did some things and one thing led to another and I ended up living this type of life and I'm not proud of it. And I need to get this off my chest before I die. The book reads quite like that. So it's not like he's bragging about killing Joe Gallo. He's saying I did it and that's it, right? I mean, there's a lot of guys on YouTube who pretend to be like mob guys and stuff like that. And they brag about this ridiculous stuff. Frank Sheeran's book doesn't read like that at all. I suggest everybody read it. It's a very good read. Joe Coffey thinks he did it. Jerry Capisi, who wrote a lot of books on the mob. I guess probably his most famous book is Murder Machine, the Roy DeMeo story. Says it's his best guess. Both these guys spent their entire lives investigating the mob, and so it's not like they're just like nobodies just saying this. Others find Frank's claim to be unbelievable, given what Gallo's widow says. She claims to have seen multiple men, all of them short with Italian features, as entering the restaurant that night. Frank Sheeran is one man that is 6'4", of mixed Irish and Swedish background, so almost virtually the exact opposite of a short Southern Italian. And that's it. Like here we end our story, and Joe Gallo's shot dead in a Greasy Spoon restaurant. But I will say, witnesses at the time said Joe Gallo didn't go out without a fight. Apparently, he did try to reach for his gun to shoot back, and that perfectly sums up Joe Gallo, in my opinion. A man against all the odds, and he never gave up and always kept fighting right until the end.
I guess for me, I mean, I'm not qualified to say anything of whether Frank Sheeran actually did kill Joe Gallo or not, but I think I have a lot of questions about it that the Irishman didn't seem to really answer. Is why did they hire Sheeran, who is working for the Bufalino family in Pennsylvania? It's not like there's no lack of wise guys in New York. I mean, I guess you could say that Joe might know some of the people if they sent somebody from the Colombo family or something to come and get him. I don't know, maybe. But again, and there's no lack of associates. Joe isn't going to know every single person in New York City who's going to pop into Umberto's Clam house on any given day. I just, I don't see the connection of why they're having somebody from out of town do this hit.
Well, even the author at the time apparently was struggling whether he was going to add that story about Frank claiming to kill Joe Gallo or not, because he had the same, I don't know, it's not, he's not providing the type of details that say he was providing, say, with Jimmy Hoffa. And we know that he had a relationship with Jimmy Hoffa. Like, this stuff is all documented, it's tangible, there's pictures of it. But there's nothing here with the Joe Gallo thing, right? Other than Frank saying that he did it. And I mean, if he's not lying about Jimmy Hoffa and he's not lying about this other stuff, I mean, why is he lying about this, right? But I mean, there's motivations for Frank to lie about this. It would help sell the book, you know?
Well, and it's the same thing. I think it's maybe it's the questions that get raised by that his Jimmy Hoffa story isn't completely solid. So you start to question, well, what he said about Jimmy Hoffa sounds a little sketchy. And then he's going to put on another big murder onto there. You know, it all sounds, it's not a slam dunk against it, but it just kind of raises your radar, your BS detector.
Well, I mean, and you're also dealing with people that killed other people for money, you know? These are like, it's going to be hard to believe these type of people, right? You know, it's hard to believe somebody who's like an alcoholic. It's hard to believe somebody who's a drug addict, you know, probably very difficult to believe somebody that's willing to kill somebody for a couple $100, you know. I mean, they were getting paid more than that, but the point still stands, right? They literally kill people. You know, sometimes they're people that are like their closest friends. In terms of Frank Sheeran, if he's not lying about Jimmy Hoffa, they were best friends. He killed them because, you know, his boss told him to do it. You know, it's, how can you believe somebody like that? To me personally, I couldn't believe anything that they said. I don't know. I wouldn't have been able to write the book because I just wouldn't believe anything he said. Like, so you're telling me that you killed your best friend for what? Because your boss told you to, and a couple $1,000s or whatever you end up getting paid for that hit. Okay. So if you're willing to do that to your best friend, obviously you're willing to lie to me. I'm nothing to you.
Yeah. There's a lot of layers to pull back on that onion of why to get to any sort of kernel of truth. And it takes you in so many different directions that, you know, that this could be completely nonsense.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe we found our next series is, how much truth is Frank Sheeran telling her? I don't know. Just talking about it a little bit here just make me want to kind of do a deep dive into it.
Well, I mean, that you could with so many of these people that we've talked about, they just have so many different incentives to lie.
Well, that's it, right? I mean, and the whole society is built on lying to everybody else, right? I mean, in theoretically, it's lie to everybody else and be honest to each other within the family, right? Like, that's how a secret society is supposed to work. We're a society that's, you know, in a society within a society. You know, that's how, you know, secretary, like, you know, breakaway, like religious groups work. And I mean, you look at throughout history, right? You got to be completely honest with the people around you, but everybody else who cares, just, you can lie to them about whatever. They don't matter, right? Because they're not one of us. But in reality, that's not really how the mob works. They lie to everybody else, but then they also lie to each other, and for good reason. A lot of the time they're committing crimes, right? So you got to be like ambiguous. You got to use ambiguity in terms of the language that you use. And, you know, we're talking about, you know, people getting murdered and drug trafficking and extortion and really horrible stuff. So it makes sense that, and it's such a bizarre thing. Like, all these guys, they talk about like how they're brothers and like family means everything. But I mean, it's all really kind of built on top of lies, is it not? I mean, lies is really what perpetuates the whole thing.
Yeah, they have all the incentive in the world to lie, to either raise their notoriety or try and lie to get themselves out of criminal trouble. And then you have just the fog of years too, where I think the book came out Frank Sheeran's memoir came out a long time after a lot of these facts, and he was no spring chicken. So, I mean, just the passage of time is going to create a lot of fog around these events. Could somebody forget entirely, oh, I didn't kill Joe Gallo, I killed Joe, it's somebody else in New York? I mean, could it be that much? Or did he, almost over time create an event in his head? I don't think any of those things are outside of the realm of possibilities.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it's, is he generally telling the truth and then he's spicing up the situation after? Or, I mean, something with Jimmy Hoffa, it's either he's telling the truth or he's lying, right?
Yeah.
If that's it, right? Like, there's no I just kind of misremembered. I didn't actually shoot Jimmy in the back of the head. My
best friend, yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's just like one of those moments in someone's life where you go like, yeah, that's something that you'll remember for the rest of your life. It's actually quite remarkable. Do this with yourself. Like, try to remember what you did, say 4 days ago, right? And actually go throughout the entire day and try to remember. I almost guarantee you, unless something remarkable happened that day, like, I don't know, you got a raise, or even that, like, the further you get away from it, but I'll just use that as an example. Oh, you got a raise. Maybe you'll remember some of that day, but you'd be amazed. Literally, like 4 days ago, you might generally remember how that day went. But if somebody's pushing you, so like, what were you doing at like 9:30? What were you doing at 10 o'clock? What were you doing? What were you doing at work at this moment? You probably won't remember. But I guarantee you, if something tragic happens that day, or you did something really bad that day, say, I don't know, killed Jimmy Hoffa, you would literally remember every minute of that day. You would, honestly. And this is a tactic that detectives use, actually, to kind of weed out people who they think are telling the truth or not telling the truth. Or somebody they say that they suspect being the killer or what have you, like, or where were you that day? And then all of a sudden they like vague memories of like, oh, I can't really remember, yada, yada, yada. But like, they'll ask other people, and all of a sudden if their best friend was killed that day, that whole day becomes crystal clear. I don't know, a little side note, but I should try that one time, actually. You'd be surprised just how quickly you forget things.
Well, we're going to leave it at that. We still have some more to get into with Joe Gallo, the Italian civil rights movement, the history, the cultural history of Joe Gallo, and the mark that he made on American culture and American mafia culture, and just the way we see all of that. So I hope you guys tune into the next episode, and it's a great help to us if you are enjoying what you're listening to today. And in these episodes, tell a friend so that your friends can become friends of ours.